Hello to everyone. Welcome to our IHRM webinar. My name is Maral Muratbekova. I'm a professor of HRM at ESCP Business School in Paris campus. So this event is part of our IHRM webinar series organized by Mila Lazarova from Simon Fraser University in Canada, Elaine Farndale from Penn State University in US, Maja Vidovic from RIT Croatia, Miguel Olives from Clarion University of Pennsylvania in US, and by Marion Festing and myself from ECP Business School. So we also have a very precious technical help from Caroline Adrian from Penn State University and Gerardo Arteaga Gonzalez from Simon Fraser University. So a bit of history. So we started our webinar in 2020 during COVID times, and now it's already 24th webinar. So we're happy to continue it as the recorded videos are highly successful with many, many views. So previous events of the IHRM webinar series are available online at our YouTube channel. So you're very, very welcome to watch them. So now it is my great pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Rebecca Piekari. So Rebecca Piekari is Markus Wallenberg Chair of International Business at Aalto University School of Business in Finland. Her recent research focuses on translation as a theoretical perspective on IB phenomena, the shifting meaning of location for cross-border activities, and the questions of socio-cultural sustainability, diversity, and inclusion in multinational corporations. She is known for her expertise in language-sensitive research and qualitative research methods in IB. Together with her co-authors, she won the 2021 JIPS Decade Award for the article on theorizing from case studies. Rebecca has also co-edited several handbooks and book chapters on these topics. She's one of the area editors of the Journal of International Business Studies and sits on several editorial boards of IB and management journals. Rebecca is also the leader and founding member of Qual Plus, the Center of Qualitative Management Research at Aalto University School of Business. She's fellow of the Academy of International Business and the European International Business Academy. So now let's talk about language. So it is with great pleasure that I pass the microphone to Rebecca, who will discuss language-sensitive research in international business.
Thank you very much, Maral, for the introduction and for the invitation to this prestigious seminar series. I greet you from Finland. It's evening here, and I'm very happy to be part of this seminar series, which has a long history already. I thought I'll say a few words about my background and why I'm doing research on language. At least it's perhaps one explanation of it. So I grew up in a bilingual family, and I was born in Germany before moving to Finland. And some of you may know that it is a bilingual country. We have Swedish and Finnish as official languages, and perhaps that has had some imprinting on my research interests. Now, for this evening or for this afternoon, for your morning, wherever you are, I have planned the following agenda. So I thought of saying a few words about the background of this field and what triggered its emergence. And then I will move to defining what language-sensitive IB research is about, and also try to give you a definition of what language means in this context, as well as provide you with at least two perspectives of how to approach language issues. But the bulk of my talk will be focused on hopefully your interests and drawing some implications of what language research could provide as a lens to those of you and the majority of you who are interested in people management issues. And I must say, I had a hard time choosing which topics to present here, because there are many, many topics that I think offer a lot of potential for the dialogue between language and people management or HR issues. But I decided to focus on careers, on talent management issues, and also say a few words about diversity, equity, and inclusion as well as then language-based discrimination, which is one of the topics I'm currently working on. And I thought of making the bridge between a translation perspective and the travel of HR practices in organizations and across organization. So that's the plan, and I very much look forward to a conversation with you at the end. So a few words about the field and how it emerged. So in the 60s and 70s, there was an interest, especially in cultural differences. And some of you may be well familiar with Edgar Hall's work, The Silent Language, a paper published in Harvard Business Review. And actually, the article isn't at all about language. It is about the importance for US expatriates to understand local cultures. And in a way, I think it is characteristic of the research at that time, because typically language was sort of bundled under the concept of culture. Now, when we then move forward in time, in the 80s and 90s, there was more systematic research looking especially at language as a concept and as a phenomenon in organizations. And when Mary Yoko Brannan, Susanne Tietze, and I were co-editing the special issue of the Journal of International Business Studies in 2014, there was actually a record number of submissions when looking at JIB's history. So we were very proud, and we took that as an indication that there's already a substantive body of work to be represented in that journal and in other outlets. Another important factor here was that some of the cross-cultural management researchers moved from the national level of analysis more into organizational interactions and exchanges between people, paying attention to language as a factor in these exchanges. Furthermore, what also coincided was a lot of important contributions to organization design in the multinational. And if you think back, there were contributions by Gunnar Hedlund on the heterarchy and Bartlett and Ghoshal on the network organization. And these organizational models were very much about horizontal flows, vertical flows, diagonal flows between units, really emphasizing communication and interaction. And finally, then, there was this issue, the phenomenon of the Japanese investments, especially in the US and later in Europe. And those investments made it very clear that in such an extreme setting, language was actually something that really affected the way these companies were run, because we know from research that Japanese organizations at the time were very much run by Japanese expatriates and in Japanese. And that sort of laid open the importance of language for many international business researchers. So that's a little bit of background of this. Now, the label language sensitive IB research refers to work that is particularly interested in two questions, one could say, in a slightly simplified way. So on the one hand, there is interest in how language diversity in multinational and multilingual organizations affects interactions at work, organizational processes, and management outcomes. At the same time, there is interest in another effect or relationship, namely how the broader environment and organizational context affects the strategic management of language. So there are these two sides, how language itself affects managerial processes and outcomes, and how the context affects the management of language. And what especially excites me is that this is very much a multidisciplinary field. So we have fascinating contributions by social linguists, economists, organization scholars, marketing scholars, and even neuroscientists, which really offers a rich dialogue. Now, the next obvious question to ask is, well, what on earth is language then in this context? And colleagues in Germany and Australia and England have coined, I think, a nice division. So Tenser, Pudelko, and Harsing are the ones I'm drawing on here. And they provide a classification which looks at this type of research from two angles. On the one hand, we can talk about work where the starting point is that we have different national languages, so Finnish, German, French, and these languages may have different statuses in organizations. There may be majority speakers, minority speakers of these language groups, and that affects interaction. And also these languages in practice come together forming hybrid languages, or English business lingua franca, for example, where any communicative resources are drawn on. So that's one category of research that looks at primarily different national languages and their relationships and interactions. The other group of work looks, if we take English as an example, looks at the world of Englishese. So here, IB researchers look at different ways of speaking in terms of accents, dialogues, in terms of English being used differently by engineers versus HR professionals, or by different scholarly communities. Or we may distinguish between a very abstract corporate language versus a very concrete corporate language, and how that affects picking up weak signals from the environment, for example. So language has many meanings in language-sensitive IB research, but the starting point was very much that there is a multiplicity of national languages in plural, rather than a discursive orientation which dominates organization and management studies. And in order to set the scene, I'd like to take one more classification, and that's a more philosophical one. So we could say that in the beginning, for most IB researchers, language and communication was very much seen as an instrument, a vehicle of communication, a means. In organization studies, on the other hand, there was earlier a realization that language may actually emerge in social interaction. So rather than existing, that you have sort of a language that you take from the shelf, if you wish, language is co-created in social interaction. If we then look at the instrumental view, suggesting that language reflects what happens in organization, the constitutive view, on the other hand, says that no, language is actually the force that constructs and enacts organizations and organizing. So organizations are all about communication. So that's an extreme view that we can see these days. And from a more methodological perspective, the instrumental view suggests that you can plug in language as a variable in statistical analysis, while the constitutive perspective says, no, you can't isolate language as a variable, but rather you should look at it in the context in which it is used. And these two perspectives exist, but I would say that there is more research taking a more constitutive or performative view these days than there used to be. Now, for those of you in the audience who are doing research in environments where you end up using different languages, and in Europe, that's quite common in international business, obviously, as well. And I thought of just mentioning some of the challenges that many of us are familiar with. So when we talk about language as a conceptual, theoretical issue, it is obviously very much also a pragmatic issue, a methodological issue. And those who collect data in a non-English language are well familiar of the hurdles of translating your work for publication. Now, in this figure that you see on the slide, the message is that language and translation have effects throughout the research process, but these effects often remain hidden because the publication conventions sort of are such that we rarely acknowledge or open up the multilingual nature of our work, even in publications that are about language. So let me illustrate this with a couple of points. I have many foreign PhD students, and not only once, but several times, I've noticed a tendency to study something which is related to their own home country, to the language that they master well. This may not be an accident. It can be related to access issues. But what I'm saying is that our language biography may also explain that we are drawn to some topics more than to others. We may read literature that is actually translated rather than the original of Foucault or Bourdieu in French, for example. And the way we frame the world may also influence how and what kind of research questions we develop. Now, I'm involved in a future-oriented study on sustainable headquarter buildings here at Aalto. And we've been doing interviews with architects and with company people. And some of these interviews have been in Finnish, in the local language. And we realized when looking at the transcripts and our notes that Finnish as a language does not have a future tense, an explicit future tense. So which means that when we are talking about imagining the future workplace, we need to be very careful and look at the information really in a contextual way in order to decipher the future orientation. Now, when we represent our interviewees in our published work in English, we may experience challenges. The meeting of languages and the bridging of languages isn't always straightforward. There are words, untranslatable words, and there are expressions that are hard to make sense of in another second or third language. Now, all of these hurdles, unfortunately, are rarely reported. And someone who has done pioneering work in this area is Susanne Titze, whose some of her recent publications are mentioned on this slide. So this was, basically the appetizer, so to say, my attempt to set the scene. And now I would like to discuss with you some of the implications that I see language research could give to HR scholars like yourselves. And I'm sure there are many more implications than what I was able to see. But let's start from language and careers. Now, you are well familiar with the components of career competence by De Filippi and Arthur from the 90s. And what I want to draw here is a link between the career competencies and language. And yes, language is a key skill for employees at multilingual workplaces, although it is not necessarily always compensated for, and sometimes it's also used as a way of discriminating unwanted national groups. The knowing whom element underscores the contribution of language to the development of professional and personal networks, and the knowing why component of career competence has to do with our identity. So I am, for example, a Swedish-speaking Finn, and that is an important part of my identity. And it may also explain our job motivation. So for me, it is important that Aalto University is actually a multilingual university with Swedish, Finnish, and English as the main languages. I also wanted to introduce you to the concept of language misfit that me and a couple of colleagues developed in a context of the study of Vaasa University. And it is a concept that refers to a perception that the person doesn't have fitting language competencies in relation to the requirements and practices of the workplace. And this misfit may be due to overqualification, but also underqualifications or a complete lack of language skills. Now, when Aalto University was formed, English became the new language. And I do remember when a number of colleagues who hadn't taught in English before were facing this challenge that, will I be able to catch up, or am I sort of a misfit with the new sort of work requirements that this international university put on its employees? Another interesting area when we talk about language and careers is career outcomes. And we can talk about subjective career outcomes, but also objective ones. And Vesa Peltokorpi is someone who has extensively studied language and HR issues in the Japanese context, especially among host country nationals of Western subsidiaries. And he has an interesting study where he establishes the relationship between foreign language proficiency, which in Japan is still not something you can take for granted, and objective career outcomes such as job promotions, wage increases, and career satisfaction. Now, talent management is an area where you are the experts, and I'm just sort of scratching the surface. But I thought of highlighting a couple of interesting pieces where language has a more central role. And Michalski and Sliva published recently an exciting study on BBC in the Arab world. And BBC decided to introduce standard Arabic as the common language in its local operations. And interestingly, that served as an attraction to journalists in the area, because that was seen as a prestige issue to be able to master the language of the local elites. If we then move along the cycle to talent review, there was an early study by Mäkelä and colleagues where they asked the question, who should be included in the talent pool of a multinational? Now, the question seems like a basic question. But what they found is that the potential candidates to be included in the talent pool were actually people who had a shared language with those on the talent review panel. So it meant that these individuals had more visibility, more voice, more weight in the organization. So that connection that perhaps shortened the distance between the evaluators on the one hand and the employees was something that mattered for the inclusion in the talent pool. If we then continue to the third stage, talent development, there I wanted to mention Neely's work that you may be familiar with, and she looked at an organization that changed its common corporate language, and that change actually meant that suddenly a number of employees didn't have the same career opportunities because they were not able to master the language of the main language of the company. And on the other hand, others then suddenly had an unearned status increase, as she describes it. So the career vistas, the possibilities inside the organization suddenly looked very different. And the last aspect has to do with language and mobility, and both psychological and physical mobility, and there is increasing evidence of that connection, which is perhaps not surprising, especially in countries like emerging countries, but also in countries like Japan, where the average level of foreign language ability is rather low. Now, if we then move to perhaps some of the unintended effects of language use, here I covered some of the planned, also some of the unintended ones, but I thought of developing this theme a little further. And here I have 4 unintended effects. I call this the 4S model. And the first one is sidetracking effect, where career paths are diverted because of language issues. The second one on the right is sifting effect, where basically, for example, in teams, you would have members of the team who control information flow and decide on perhaps what's translated and what is not translated. A stagnating effect means that we have a person who is basically stuck in the same job role because of language issues. And a silencing effect that I think we have all experienced, where someone in the group isn't able or isn't willing to contribute because of language competence-related issues. I thought of focusing on the top one and the bottom one in the following figure. So here you have a multilingual organization, a pyramid, and you have then a common language, a standardized language, Arabic in the BBC example, that sort of creates a language ceiling. The language walls refer to a situation where the choice of the common language actually influences the size of the talent pool. So potential candidates may deselect the employer because, for example, they feel that in a Swedish-speaking bank, they would not have opportunities for career growth. So you can see from the arrows that there is a connection between career opportunities. Obviously, not all career paths are vertical, but I also want to highlight this arrow where someone is stuck in a position. And I remember talking to a Nokia engineer a while ago who said that he was a China specialist. He had learned the Chinese language and he had a lot of experience about the local market. And what he said is that after years of working in China, he felt that he would have liked to break out from the stigma of being a China specialist, so to say. And he couldn't. He said that always when he would apply for a job, he would get the feedback, well, but we'd actually like to give you responsibilities for China. So sometimes that high level of fluency may actually backlash. So we've talked about a little bit about careers, about talent management, and let me now move to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I'd like to say at the start that language is different from some of the other dimensions of diversity. If you think about gender, if you think about race, language is less stable. It's much more dynamic and fluid because we can learn languages and we can also forget languages. It is also a skill, unlike some of the other dimensions, because it affects our performance and it is part of our identity. And that side can be harder to change. So in this regard, language is a very peculiar, very particular dimension of diversity. And what is interesting is that if you look at diversity research, much more attention has been paid to gender and race, for example, than language in this body of work. Now, in language-sensitive IB research, we could say that the early work already recognized language as a salient basis for social categorization. So early work already identified in-groups and out-groups based on language considerations. And there's some very interesting work on privilege, where English is seen as a privilege, and an article I just gave to my master's students to read. But the literature on discrimination on the one hand, and the literature on language, those two literatures have not been often combined. So there are some exceptions, but not too many. And what is very exciting in my view is that language-based discriminatory behaviors, they can very well easily be seen as a form of modern discrimination. So when traditional discrimination was seen as blunt and very overt, modern discrimination has been described as something which is subtle, something which is low in intensity, unintentional perhaps, but still may isolate and handicap colleagues at work. And while the anti-discrimination legislation picks up and prohibits discrimination based on gender or race, for example, or other diversity dimensions, it does not actually cover language-based discrimination, which is interesting. So there's no legal protection against it, despite it being very, very harmful with implications for health, stress, and employee well-being. So my PhD student and I have a project on language-based discrimination, and we've offered the following definition. It refers to either a spoken or written situation where individuals are put to an unfair disadvantage compared to other groups in the organization due to their language skills. Now, I have underlined or emphasized the word unfair, and let me give you a couple of examples so that you get a feel for why this might be challenging. So in this consultancy company in Finland that we are studying, the Finnish government agency required all the customer reports, all the reports from the consultancy company in Finnish. And the company decided that this project will be fully run by employees who are able to speak Finnish. So the non-Finnish speakers were excluded. Now, is this unfair treatment? Another example would be that HR organizes staff training, and this staff training was originally intended to be offered in English. The organization does not have a mandated language, but unofficially English is used and sometimes Finnish is used. And the training then, on the request of one of the colleagues, was instead offered in Finnish. And the argument was that, well, we only have 1 or 2 foreigners here, and in the long run, they should learn the local language, shouldn't they? Is this unfair treatment? I will leave you to think what the answer in your opinion is, but this is typical in modern discrimination, that the contextual factors matter, and it's very hard to pinpoint actually what is unfair, whether it's the intention of HR department or the colleague or the customer or something else. So these are complex matters both to study and to remedy. Now, I have primarily referred to physical settings, or perhaps assumed a physical setting, but discrimination and language-based discrimination can equally well occur in virtual settings. And in this study that we are doing, there were many examples of that. Much of the existing research on language-based discrimination has emphasized interpersonal discrimination. But in our study, we could see that especially corporate communications initiatives and some of the HR initiatives were actually acts of organizational language-based discrimination. So one could see that the concept can be expanded, and it's more nuanced, more diverse, and the virtual isolation is an interesting phenomenon which is very much in the current time. Now I have a few more things I wanted to say before I will give the word to you. And one of them is translation, which I'm currently working on, as Moral said, and something which I think has a lot of potential for researchers interested not only in language, but also other things. So from my discipline, IB's perspective, translation is often defined and understood as something interlingual, basically. But when we turn to other disciplines, both translation studies for that matter, and organization and management studies, translation is a broader term, and it refers both to the movement of practices as well as their transformation, and not only in a linguistic sense, but also in terms of institutional changes and adaptations, cultural changes, and so on. What is interesting here is that when we combine the linguistic meaning of translation and this broader cultural and institutional translation, the language aspect actually leaves visible traces in the data. So when you see that the meaning of a word has been changed into another language, you can very concretely see as a researcher the change. But I wanted to give you this figure just to sort of see what I'm talking about. So what we are proposing is that as researchers, we might provide richer explanations if we combined the interlingual meaning of translation with this broader meaning of change and transformation. And when looking, for example, at the travel of HR practices such as talent management or diversity management, now they often come from the US or from Japan to the US and then to Europe. We know from research that it's rare that we could take a practice as is. It requires translation, sense-making locally to make things fit. And here on the figure, you see how perhaps a group of consultants work at headquarters, and then this new practice is cascaded down. And it may be a different translation in the R&D function versus the HR versus manufacturing. So even locally, you may work with different translations of the same practice. And I think this offers us, I think, a lot of opportunities to combine expertise from other fields who have worked with these issues for decades already. And they also have a useful vocabulary for us to draw on. So just to give you a taste of the vocabulary, I have here the interlingual translation from translation studies, and then I have what we have called metaphorical translation, which involves these other transformations of a practice. And we have here on the translator row a term, paraprofessional translator. And I love this term because it refers to ordinary managers, employees, and also external consultants who engage in a lot of translation work, which may take a bulk of their working time, but still they may not get compensated for that. And they may also have their own agendas when they insert meanings that they want to drive in the organization. If you have questions about this, I would be happy to answer. But at this point, I will leave and move to concluding. So one could ask then, well, what does it take to establish a new field, to institutionalize it? And I think there are 5 main issues that I can see at the moment, and we are working with a couple of colleagues on this. So first of all, a dedicated academic association. And GEMETEL, the French-based Groupe d'études de management des langages, has been such a forum for those interested in language issues, in not only in IB, but also in other fields. I've already referred to one special issue, but actually there have been several dedicated to language and communication in IB, broadly speaking, and they've been important milestones for the community. And there's been some wonderful edited volumes. And what is interesting, that these volumes have not only brought together IB scholars, but also those who typically work with monolingual disciplines and rather talk about discourse as a resource rather than languages in plural, as my colleague Susanne Titze often says. And there have been a number of review articles that have taken stock of research accumulated today. But finally, I think all of us who are wearing hats of authors, reviewers, editors, supervisors, why don't we give up our monolingual mindset when publishing and engage in greater reflexivity in terms of the multilingual data sets and the sense making that we do behind the scenes? I think we could make that much more visible. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very, very much, Rebecca. It was very rich and very inspiring as a presentation. So we have many questions here coming. So the first one is, what advice do you give a PhD student who meets with translation hurdles when translating empirical data into English?
Yeah, this is something that is rarely discussed, I think, in published work. And I think these hurdles should be seen as resources, actually. And I think when we are confronted with something that is hard to translate, it may actually be a window into something really interesting, a finding, or something that we didn't expect we didn't anticipate to see. So I would stop and reflect during those moments and really discuss what makes it difficult, and perhaps talk to someone from that culture. So I remember in my own PhD, although it was something in English that I faced, idiomatic expressions or references to critic from Australia. And I do remember that I had no idea what it meant in the context, but by consulting the locals, I could get a feel for what the humoristic aspect of that comment was. But I think instead of seeing them as hurdles, we should treasure, or we could treasure them and make more of them in terms of insight and novel information.
That's great. I like it very much. Yes, use it as a resource instead of, and be reflexive actually on the difficulties that you have. And so her second question by Suzanne, always, is there any evidence that English is no longer the undisputed common corporate language, and that local languages, see your examples about Arabic, for example, are gaining more standing and prestige?
Well, I think organizations are increasingly seeing this issue about a common corporate language less as an either-or question, but perhaps more as both and seeing that in some parts of the organization, you need to have that leeway to operate in a local language. And that's the only right choice in that situation. And on the other hand, then with the global financial markets, for example, it is likely to be English. The study on BBC in the Arab world is a wonderful study. And one of the reasons, in my view, is that much of the work on the common corporate language has focused on the negative side of it. And this study actually portrays a very positive view. And as you pointed out, Susanne, it really emphasizes the value also for the local recruitment of the local language. So it is, I think, an exceptional study in that way.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Julia Brandl asks, you speak about the subtle forms of language-based discriminations, and they are very important. And it would be interesting to learn what you think of research on wordings in gender-related issues. So what do you think about this kind of research?
So what do I think about studies on gendered language? I think we've seen in international business research rather little on that. So it would fall under the category of intralingual level. And so we would look at masculine versus feminine expressions. And my university, for example, puts job ads through a so-called gender decoder, which is common in many organizations where they pick up masculine or feminine expressions. In my case, in our school's case, it's often that we emphasize competition and excellence, which are coded as masculine expressions. And if we want to improve the gender balance at the university and attract more female researchers, we need to be more neutral in our language research. So I think I'm excited about those studies and especially in management and organization studies, there's more focus on that aspect in my view.
Okay, thank you. And Philippe Lecomte, that I suppose you know him very well. Dear Rebecca, thank you very much for your outstanding presentation and for quoting Jem and Al. So he says that in his experience, many colleagues have difficulties to differentiate between linguistic and metaphorical translation. So could you develop on this a bit more?
Yes, that's another good question. And given those labels, interlingual translation and metaphorical translation, our colleagues in translation studies were unhappy about interlingual translation because they think they are not just translating between languages, but they are also translating between cultures. And the organization theorists whose work we labeled as metaphorical translation said that, look, it's not metaphorical. Things are actually moving from one place to another. It's much more physical, not just metaphorical. So neither camp was very happy with our labels. If we forget those two labels and think about translation work in organizations, I think in reality, and in multilingual organizations, it would involve interlingual, it will involve cultural, institutional, organizational, perhaps community of practice changes in the object that you are translating. So I do think a more integrated approach is in place, and perhaps we need to rethink the label. So thank you, Philip, for your questions.
Okay, thank you very much. I like this question very much. What are the ways to maintain and demonstrate the multilingual nature of a study in a paper published in English?
Someone called Innan Sasaki, a Finnish-Japanese researcher who has published in the Journal of International Business Studies and other journals on old Japanese organizations. So really on the longevity of these organizations. And what she has done is that in her paper, she actually inserts certain words in Japanese. So instead of trying to replace them with English equivalents, she leaves them visible. And there's also Japanese letters. Sylvia Siuk and colleagues, they actually, in a study on Poland, they actually use Polish pseudonym names for the interviewees to maintain that feel of foreignness. And that's another way of leaving traces of other languages. Now, in social linguistics, it is very common to actually have quotations in the original language and English. In my field, it is rare to see that, but there are ways, and perhaps thinking about inserting key words could be one option. So food for thought, I guess. But again, there are no established conventions. So collectively, we need to create them.
Yeah, that's it. Very interesting to leave the traces, the visibility of the thing. There is a very interesting question. I think the answer could be short, but I don't know. From Yeonju Cho. Is there any research on workers having difficulties in speaking? For example, deaf people, but I think not only, given the definition of language in this field?
This is a very thoughtful question, and I must say that sort of deaf language, for example, wasn't included in my list of different languages. I haven't seen any work, but I do think that, again, combining diversity research on physical disabilities with then some of the IB research has very nice and interesting potential. So, yeah, relatively short answer.
Yeah, but continuing in this topic of the inclusivity in terms of languages, Christoph Barmeyer asks, again, thank you for the presentation, the great presentation. In my view, he says the research is still quite Nordic in terms of languages and subjects. Would we need more research of intercultural mixed research teams from very diverse research, linguistic and cultural contexts, Latin America, Africa, Asia, to give new insights?
I think that's a very constructive and sort of visionary perspective. And I agree with Christoph that for solid research in this area, the research team should also be equipped with these skills and competencies that so that they would exist within the team rather than having to outsource them or buy them from outside. So if we have a team where both the theoretical, methodological, and the understanding of the phenomenon come together, I think that's a winning team. And indeed, there is a strong focus overall on Western research in IB, and I think many studies from other regions, such as the one by Madeleine Bausch, perhaps, which I mentioned from Latin America, is worth mentioning in this context.
Okay, thank you very much, Rebecca. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for more questions, but I just wanted to acknowledge, because Suzanne is writing now, Suzanne Tietze, and Vlad Weiman and many other people in the question and answers. They thank you very, very much for your great presentation. They like it very much. I also
Thank you.
adored this presentation. So just to conclude, we have 2 calls for papers in the IHRM special issue, but it is coming soon. And one is in Journal of World Business. And we have also 2 conferences to advertise as well. So if it's of interest to you, it would be great if we see your submissions or we meet at the conferences. And then I would like to repeat once more that this talk is a part of series, and the next one is scheduled on May 25th with Stacey Fitzsimmons and her colleagues. And the topic would be, how well does IB research address equality, diversity, and inclusion? So I would like to say a big thank you to you, Rebecca, again, very much.
Thank
to
you
all
so much.
colleagues who are involved in organizing this webinar, and of course to all participants who were very active today. So we hope you found it very interesting and useful, and hope to see you on May 25. Thank you very much.